July 1945. The air in Berlin was still and heavy with the scent of ash and damp stone. In the district of Wilmersdorf, the city resembled a vast graveyard of shattered buildings and broken lives. The once bustling neighborhoods now stood silent, reduced to skeletons of brick and twisted metal. Every corner spoke of war's final fury: blackened windows, crumbled facades, scorched streets littered with debris. People moved like ghosts, their expressions numb, their eyes hollow from hunger and grief. Inside the basement of a partially collapsed building, Marta Berner crouched with her 3 children. They had turned the damp cellar into a makeshift shelter using old curtains, crates, and what remained of their furniture. Her youngest, a boy of 4, was running a fever. The middle child had developed a hacking cough weeks earlier. The eldest, Anna, had taken on adult responsibilities far too early, silently watching over her siblings as their mother scavenged for food. Marta's husband had not returned from the Eastern Front. No letter, no grave, no certainty, just an aching absence. Every night she lay awake in the darkness, listening to rats scurrying above and the distant sound of arguments over bread crusts. Her world had shrunk to a few square meters of damp concrete and silence. Hope had long since given way to routine survival. She had not eaten in 2 days, saving everything she found for her children. On the morning of July 12th, Marta heard an unfamiliar sound rising through the stillness. Engines, several of them. She tensed, instinctively pulling her children closer. German propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as brutal conquerors who would punish civilians mercilessly. Women would be taken, children orphaned, old people left to die. The noise grew louder. Heavy trucks rolled into the street, their tires crunching over broken glass. She peeked through the boarded-up window. The vehicles were olive green, marked with white stars. American. Soldiers jumped down from the trucks, moving with purpose. Marta watched them set up what looked like tables and erect a canvas tent. There were no guns drawn, no shouting, just motion, coordination, and crates, piles of crates being unloaded. One of the soldiers, a young man with a sun-browned face, unfurled a large sign written in German: "Emergency Aid Station, Food and Medical Assistance." Marta stared at the words, not trusting her eyes. Another soldier, older and wearing sergeant's stripes, called out in broken German, "Come tomorrow, food, for families, bring papers." Marta's hands began to shake. Was this real? Her body was torn between fear and desperate curiosity. The instinct to hide was strong, but stronger was the hunger gnawing at her children's ribs. She spent the rest of the day watching from the shadows, unsure if it was a trick or a miracle. That night, she whispered to her children, "Tomorrow, we go see what they want. Maybe it's true." The next morning, Marta rose early. She wrapped her youngest in a threadbare blanket and tied the other shoes with twine. As they stepped out into the gray morning, she braced for cruelty. Instead, she found something else: order, structure, and the first hint of a strange possibility, that the war might be truly over, and that those once called enemies were here not to punish, but to help. Friedrich Kuntz sat on the edge of a broken fountain in what used to be the city square, his hands covered in dust and grease. A civil engineer before the war, he had once overseen water systems for entire districts of Berlin. Now he couldn't even provide clean water for his wife and daughter. Their apartment had been destroyed in a bombing raid in March, and for the past 4 months they had been living in the charred remains of a warehouse. Every day blurred into the next. Endless walks through rubble, queues for soup, silent dinners of nothing.
After Germany's surrender, Friedrich refused to work for the occupying forces. He had too much pride, too much anger, and too many questions about what came next. To him, collaborating with Americans felt like surrendering again, only this time morally. His wife tried to reason with him, pointing to their malnourished daughter, to the infected cut on her foot that they couldn't afford to treat. But Friedrich couldn't bring himself to say yes, not yet.
That changed when she fainted from hunger. It happened on a Thursday while they stood in line for a charity meal that never came. She crumpled in his arms like wet paper. In that moment, something inside him broke, something rigid and nationalistic that had kept him from accepting help. The next day, he found the American office set up in the former town hall. He signed his name on a form, handed over his papers, and waited in silence. The officer who met him was Captain Robert Jackson, a 35-year-old from Ohio with a calm voice and practical demeanor. He didn't ask Friedrich about politics, ideology, or wartime loyalties. He simply glanced at Friedrich's resume, raised his eyebrows, and said, "Water infrastructure? We need you. You start tomorrow." It was that simple. No lectures, no suspicion, just work. On his first day, Friedrich arrived at a bombed-out pumping station in the southern sector. Half the roof was gone, the control panels warped from heat, pipes bent like twisted bones. American engineers were already there, unloading equipment from trucks. One handed Friedrich a set of tools and gestured for him to help lift a valve assembly. They worked side by side in silence, sweat soaking their shirts by noon. At first, Friedrich expected mockery or judgment. He thought the Americans might treat him as the enemy he had once been. But instead, they listened when he spoke, followed his suggestions, and respected his knowledge. One younger soldier even asked him to explain how the old German system had been designed. For the first time in years, Friedrich felt useful again, like more than a survivor. Days turned into weeks. Together, German workers and American soldiers cleared debris, mapped damaged lines, and restored pressure to pipes that hadn't carried water in months. Friedrich came home at night exhausted but transformed. His daughter's fever broke. His wife started smiling again. The city remained broken, but something invisible had begun to shift. Trust, purpose, a thin thread of normalcy. One afternoon, while tightening a valve with Captain Jackson, Friedrich paused and looked around. The pumps were humming. Water was flowing again. A nearby mother filled a bucket and wiped tears from her cheeks. Jackson caught Friedrich's gaze and said quietly, "Better to build than destroy, right?" Friedrich nodded. The words weren't grand, but they were true. And in the silence that followed, he realized this wasn't just labor, it was healing, for all of them. Helga Schneider had lived most of her 8 years in the shadow of war. Her earliest memories were not of toys or laughter, but of the shriek of sirens and the trembling of the ground as bombs fell. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front when she was only 4. Her mother, once bright and hopeful, now sat for hours staring at the floor, her eyes empty. The family lived in a single room of a shattered tenement, its windows boarded, its walls scorched. Hunger was constant, a dull ache that never went away. Every morning, Helga wandered through the ruins, barefoot, searching for anything edible, burnt bread, moldy potatoes, or metal scraps she could trade for food. She had learned to move quietly, to avoid soldiers and strangers. Her mother warned her never to trust the occupiers, especially the Americans. "They hate us," she whispered. "They will take what little we have left." But Helga didn't understand hate. She only understood hunger and the emptiness of her stomach. One day, as she scavenged near a collapsed school building, she heard laughter, real laughter, clear and foreign. She crept closer and saw a group of children gathered around American soldiers outside a small aid tent. The men were handing out biscuits and something shiny wrapped in silver paper.
Helga froze. Chocolate! She had seen it once before, years ago, when Berlin still had shops. Now it seemed like a legend. Her heart pounded as she watched one soldier kneel to hand a bar to a boy not much older than her. When the soldier noticed her watching from behind a pile of bricks, he smiled and motioned for her to come closer. Helga didn't move. Fear held her in place. The soldier reached into his pocket, pulled out another bar, and extended his hand. For a long moment she stood trembling. Then hunger won. She darted forward, snatched the chocolate, and ran as fast as she could, expecting to hear gunfire behind her. But there were no shots, only the faint sound of someone laughing kindly. At home, her grandmother insisted it was poison. Her mother examined the bar for minutes, searching for proof of danger. Finally, she broke off a small piece and tasted it. Her eyes widened. It was real. Sweetness filled the room for the first time in years. They divided the chocolate into small pieces, savoring each bite as if it were gold. For a few minutes, the war faded, replaced by silence and sugar. That night, Helga dreamt not of bombs, but of kindness. A week later, word spread that schools were reopening. The Americans had cleared rubble from several buildings and found surviving teachers. The idea seemed absurd. How could there be schools in a city of ruins? But the next morning, Helga's mother woke her early and dressed her in the least torn dress they had. The classroom had no glass in the windows and only half a roof, but there were desks, notebooks, and even chalk. For the first time in years, children sat in rows, not to hide, but to learn. Among the teachers was an American soldier who spoke simple German. He showed them pictures of his home and taught them English words. Helga realized it was the same man who had given her chocolate. She stared at him, trying to understand how someone she'd been told to fear could be gentle. When class ended, he said, "See you tomorrow," and waved. She waved back without thinking, the gesture small but full of meaning. In the following weeks, Helga began to smile again. She brought home new words each day: bread, peace, friend. Her mother listened, quietly amazed. For the first time since the war ended, the child's voice carried a tone of hope. The ruins around them were still vast, but in one classroom, under a half-collapsed roof, a generation was beginning to rebuild not just their city, but their belief in goodness. Private Michael O'Neill sat on an overturned crate outside the American command post, staring at the smoking ruins across the street. He had been in Berlin for 3 weeks, and still every sunrise brought the same uneasy feeling. The city looked less like a victory and more like a graveyard of humanity. He had fought across France, seen comrades killed in the Ardennes, and watched the horrors of Dachau unfold before his eyes. Now he was here, surrounded not by soldiers, but by civilians, thin, pale, and beaten by hunger. It was supposed to feel like triumph. It didn't. Everywhere he went, he saw children digging through rubble and women standing in lines that stretched for blocks. They didn't look like enemies. They looked like victims of something vast and cruel that had devoured everyone, even those who had once believed in it. Yet part of him resisted compassion. These people, he reminded himself, had cheered for Hitler. They had marched under swastikas and believed in conquest. Some of his friends were buried because of them. Mercy felt like betrayal. One afternoon, while delivering food rations to a temporary shelter, Michael found himself face to face with an elderly man clutching a child's hand. The man looked terrified, mumbling, "Bitte, bitte," over and over. Michael reached into his pack and handed the man a loaf of bread. The old man hesitated, then began to cry silently, holding the bread like it was sacred. The child smiled shyly at Michael and whispered, "Danke." It was a single word, but it struck deeper than any bullet. He walked away, unable to shake the image of their faces. That night, he wrote a letter home. "Dad," he began, "we're feeding the same people we fought against. It feels strange. Sometimes it feels wrong. But when you see a kid starving, you can't hate him. You just can't." He stopped writing for a while, staring at the candlelight flickering on the wall. Then he added, "Maybe that's what makes us different from them. We don't win by killing. We win by choosing to be human." In the days that followed, Michael's duties expanded. He helped distribute medical supplies, rebuild a damaged school, and even taught basic English to children in the afternoons. The first time he entered a classroom, the students froze, too frightened to speak. But when he smiled and said slowly, "Hello," a few giggled. He wrote simple words on the chalkboard: bread, home, peace. The children repeated them in uncertain voices. It was a small thing, but it made him feel more useful than any battle had. Still, the contradictions gnawed at him. He passed the bombed-out church where German civilians buried their dead in shallow graves. He heard stories of Soviet soldiers across the river, how they looted, drank, and took what they wanted. It reminded him that even in victory, men could become monsters. His own army was trying to prove something different, that power could rebuild instead of destroy. But was it truly enough? Could mercy undo what hatred had built? One evening, as the sun set over the ruins, Michael sat beside Sergeant Lewis, an older veteran who had served since North Africa. "You ever wonder why we're helping them?" Michael asked quietly. Lewis took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Because someone has to," he said. "You feed a starving man today, and maybe he won't pick up a rifle tomorrow." It wasn't idealism. It was logic, stripped down to survival. But it carried a truth Michael couldn't ignore. A week later, while passing through a devastated block, Michael saw a young boy sitting alone on a pile of stones. He recognized him from the school, Helga's classmate, a quiet boy who rarely spoke. The boy held out a crumpled drawing, a soldier giving bread to a child. "You," he said in broken English. Michael took the paper, unable to speak. In that moment, something inside him softened completely. He realized he was no longer here as a conqueror, but as part of a fragile attempt to rebuild the human soul of a ruined city. That night, as he walked back to camp, the streets of Berlin were quiet. The war had taken everything from both sides: lives, homes, faith. But in those ruins, Michael saw something he hadn't felt in years: a beginning, a possibility that compassion could outlive violence. And for the first time since the war started, he felt a measure of peace. Not because the fighting had ended, but because he had finally understood why he was still there. In the American sector of Berlin, reconstruction had become more than just a task. It was a ritual of rebirth. Streets once impassable from rubble were gradually cleared, not by machines alone, but by human hands. German women, many widowed and grieving, took to the ruins with scarves on their heads and shovels in their arms. They formed what became known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Together, they worked shoulder to shoulder, hauling bricks, stacking debris, and sweeping away ash from the doorsteps of the dead. It was not about pay. It was about reclaiming dignity. The Americans provided tools and structure. They divided districts, set timetables, and supplied wheelbarrows and gloves. Where possible, they brought in bulldozers to assist, but most of the effort remained painfully manual. Every cleared brick felt like a step towards something better. Slowly, the outlines of neighborhoods reappeared: shops, churches, schools, skeletal but visible. The city was beginning to lift its head. Friedrich Kunz continued his work with the water systems, now supervising small teams of German laborers. He reported to Captain Jackson daily, offering updates on pipe pressure, contamination, and repair schedules. They had developed an unspoken rhythm: briefings in the morning, repairs by afternoon, silent nods of respect by dusk. Jackson had stopped calling him Mr. Kunz and simply said Friedrich, as if the war that once separated them no longer mattered.
It surprised Friedrich how natural it began to feel.
In the evenings, families gathered around the restored water pumps, filling pails and washing children. Laughter returned in cautious bursts, tentative, almost guilty at first. American soldiers sometimes stood nearby, watching quietly, handing out blankets or powdered milk. There was no grand celebration, no speeches, but each restored utility, each brick placed in the right spot was an act of defiance against despair.
Meanwhile, new posters appeared on the walls, announcements for school enrollments, job opportunities, and vaccination drives. The American military government worked with local Germans to reopen clinics and employment centers. Bakeries resumed operation using flour from the aid convoys. Children stopped begging in the streets and instead carried books under their arms. It was a fragile ecosystem, but it was functioning. Then came the care packages, boxes from civilians in the United States, shipped across the ocean to strangers in a city they'd never seen. Each package was a small miracle. Inside were canned meats, soap, socks, and notes in warm, uncertain handwriting. "We hope this helps," one read. "We're praying for your family." Marta Berner received one in early 1946. She opened it slowly, reverently, as though it were a relic. When she read the letter, her hands trembled. "These people don't know us," she told her children. "They owe us nothing, but they're helping anyway." The children examined every item, fascinated by the labels, the unfamiliar logos, the American handwriting. Marta kept the letter, folded carefully in a drawer. It became more than paper. It was evidence that forgiveness could exist even after fire. Even Michael O'Neill, once skeptical, began to change. He helped unload care packages at the rail station, reading the addresses as if they were sacred. To a family in Berlin, from Detroit, from Kansas City, from Des Moines. He imagined the senders, housewives, teachers, factory workers, choosing to help the children of their former enemies. It softened something deep inside him. War had destroyed everything, but ordinary people, with their quiet gestures, were building something new. By spring, the air felt different. The cold was still there, the ruins still massive, but the silence had been replaced by sounds of labor, learning, and laughter. German civilians and American soldiers no longer looked through each other, but at each other. The wall of resentment had begun to crack, not with apologies or politics, but with shared effort and simple kindness. And in that quiet transformation, a strange truth began to take root, that enemies could become partners, and strangers could lay the foundation for peace, one brick, one meal, one word at a time. By the summer of 1948, the American sector of Berlin had transformed in ways few thought possible. The streets, once impassable with debris, were now navigable and lined with storefronts beginning to reopen. Public services, electricity, clean water, sewage had returned to most districts. Schools were filled with students, factories slowly resumed production, and hospitals operated with help from American and German staff alike. The scars of war remained visible, but so too did the signs of recovery. A broken city was learning to stand again. Friedrich Kunz walked through a neighborhood he had helped restore, watching children play in the spray of a repaired fountain. His daughter, now healthy and growing, had started school and learned to say thank you in English. Friedrich still wore the same work boots he'd received from the American quartermaster 2 years earlier. They were scuffed but dependable, like the friendships he'd formed with men he once would have feared. He and Captain Jackson now shared coffee every Friday morning, discussing everything from water pressure to philosophy. At the local schoolhouse, Helga sat near the front of her class, notebook open, repeating English phrases after her teacher. The man at the front was no longer just a soldier. He was Mr. O'Neill now, her part-time instructor and unofficial guardian. He smiled as he taught, proud not just of the children's progress, but of his own. Berlin had changed him. What began as obligation had turned into commitment, and then into something even deeper, compassion. He had seen the city in ruins and helped raise it, brick by brick, word by word. Meanwhile, Marta Berner found herself working at a clinic organized by the American Red Cross. Her youngest child no longer coughed through the night, and her eldest volunteered to help distribute aid to newer refugees arriving from the East. They were still poor, they were still rebuilding, but they no longer lived in fear. And every time she handed a child a blanket or a mother a packet of medicine, Marta remembered the day the first ration line opened and the world tilted toward hope. The difference between the American and Soviet sectors became increasingly clear. In the East, people whispered of disappearances and hunger. In the West, they whispered too, but of opportunity. Families crossed dangerous boundaries just to register for schooling or food under the Americans. The idea of freedom, once abstract and foreign, began to have a shape. Order, fairness, dignity. Berliners noticed and remembered. Then came the blockade. In 1948, the Soviets tried to starve West Berlin into submission by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access. But the groundwork had already been laid. The trust built over 3 years became the foundation of resistance. The Berlin airlift began. Day and night, American and British planes delivered food, coal, medicine. Berliners watched the skies, counting each aircraft with gratitude. The same hands that had once dropped bombs now delivered bread. Friedrich, Martha, Helga, and thousands more stood at Tempelhof Airport, waving as planes descended in steady rhythm. Some cried, others saluted. It wasn't just aid, it was a promise that they would not be abandoned, that their lives mattered, and that the bonds forged through mercy were stronger than those forged through fear. By 1949, unemployment in the American sector had dropped dramatically. Infrastructure had been restored to near pre-war levels. Education was thriving. A generation of children now spoke both German and English. And the people of Berlin, once taught to hate the very men who helped them rebuild, spoke of Americans not as conquerors, but as neighbors. In her final journal entry years later, Marta wrote, "They fed us. They didn't have to, but they did. They taught our children, helped our wounded, and rebuilt what we had destroyed. They brought more than food. They brought back our sense of worth." The legacy of those years endured not in monuments, but in relationships, in lives saved, in futures reclaimed. The ruins of 1945 had become the foundations of partnership. And in those years between war and peace, Berlin became something rare, a place where enemies had the courage to act like humans, and where a broken world dared to believe in healing. Not through force, but through decency. Not through vengeance, but through a quiet, persistent kindness that would echo for generations to come.